Did the latest US GDP report just signal that the rest of the economic accounts may be more accurate as far as the state of the US economy? When GDP surged to almost 5% in the third quarter of last year, many people were taken aback by that and thought, what is really happening here? Is the economy in the United States booming? I mean, everyone else around the rest of the world saw their systems fall into recession or close to it, or they were already in recession to begin with. That 5% quarter really stuck out. And then GDP was down a little bit, but not all that much in the fourth quarter, which just reinforced the idea that the US was in some parallel universe of booming conditions, despite the fact that there was so much other data that suggested the economy was actually struggling. And the people in America who are trying to operate in that economy are really struggling. We don't feel like GDP was 5% or 3.3% or whatever it was in the fourth quarter. So just this week, BEA comes out with the first quarter estimate for GDP, and it's only 1.6%. Not only was that the lowest in 2 years, that was well below expectations that were driven by this sharp increase at the end of last year. Everybody thought, well, 2.5% sounds about right for this type of economy. So a whole percent less than expectations, but also raising these other questions. The sharp slowdown since the third quarter. Is GDP starting to pick up some of the same signals that we've been getting from all this other alternative data around the global and US economy? We're talking about PMIs, inventory, manufacturing, some services statistics, and a whole bunch of others, including labor numbers. We keep seeing from a lot of labor sources that companies are at least under some substantial pressure. Certainly the amount of pressure you wouldn't expect with a 5% GDP quarter sustained over a prolonged period of time. And that's really the issue here that we need to figure out. Are we seeing an economy that's settling in gently to a stable, soft landing with disinflation? Or does this big up and down suggest instability that might be more consistent with alternative sources that suggest the US is actually struggling? To help me make sense of all of this, especially the shocking GDP number, I'm going to bring in here Mr. Stephen Van Metre. As always, Steve, thank you very much for joining me. Let's start there. What did you make of the GDP report?
Jeff, it's interesting because there's really two sides to this. If you're on the soft landing narrative, then this is, hey, can't you see? We slowed down. We're heading to a soft landing. And what have we been hearing from, the Fed and the Biden administration is it's the second half of the year. So, well, it's only April. This makes perfect sense. The economy's slowing down. Remember, the boom times are coming soon. So this is just a natural expectation of what we expected from monetary policy. Or you can look at it on the other side of the fence, is that perhaps the big GDP numbers was a lot due to inventory building, which I have a suspicion it was based on all the data we're seeing, and that perhaps the consumers aren't keeping up with inflation, as you and I have talked about repeatedly. The risk here isn't the number today. It's going to be the number next quarter, because if this continues to go down, then the whole soft landing narrative is completely out the door.
We also have to consider one other factor, right, Steve? And that's crude oil. I mean, crude oil was up sharply. It didn't seem to make much of a dent last year when oil prices surged in the middle of last year, last summer, because that was the GDP quarter. That was the 5% quarter, which I think we both know that was a lot of that was government spending as well as government transfers. So we had the huge quarter last year. Oil prices didn't seem to make much of a difference. But now we're seeing a lot of, again, alternative data sources suggesting that the economy, which was supposed to be getting back up and maybe accelerating again into the second quarter, maybe took another bad step in April. Certainly the S&P Global PMI reports for the month of April were quite concerning, because expectations like GDP were for an acceleration rather than a deceleration. So S&P Global comes out and says, manufacturing PMI, that's back below 50 after only 2 weeks above 50, or only 2 months above 50. Services getting down close to 50, which there's a very good inverse relationship between the services PMI, really the services economy, and oil prices, as you would expect. If you got to pay more for gasoline, you've got less left over for primarily discretionary spending, which is largely services. So maybe that's another factor we should consider, that GDP, while it was unbothered by the oil price shock last year, maybe the first quarter is starting to pick up some of that weakness too.
Yeah, Jeff, and that would make sense because if indeed consumers were strapped, which we've been making the case they are, that high oil prices are a huge problem for them because, as you just said, hey, I've got to spend more money on gas or electricity, and that eats away from my discretionary budget, which is now getting reflected in GDP data. So the whole interesting that, hey, we're experiencing a soft landing. Well, as you mentioned, the PMI reports had some really telling information on the employment side, at least on the manufacturing, and even a little on the services side. Is that, well, hey, wait a minute here. We're starting to lay people off, or maybe we're going to start a second round, depending on which report we're looking at. And that's not what you expect out of the soft landing. In fact, it's telling us that perhaps the U.S. economy is going to further decelerate here over the next quarter, and that would just wipe out any notion that there is a potential soft landing happening.
Yeah, that was interesting from S&P Global. We had heard from ISM before that employment seemed to be contracting, or at least, companies were taking some significant steps to control their costs. S&P Global, in their April flash PMI, for the very first time mentioned that employers were cutting back on hours, cutting back on workers, cutting back on headcounts, all of that stuff. So that potentially significant, at the very least, it puts the S&P Global PMI into the same category as the household survey, which has suggested all along that employment is nothing like the payroll report. Now S&P Global is saying, yeah, we kind of see that too.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Jeff, because we're a week away from another payroll report. And we can kind of guess it's going to look good because you're looking at the weekly unemployment claims. And we kind of jokingly said last week, if you pick 212, well, you'd be right. Well, okay, maybe it would be revised higher. But you look at the weekly claims data and you have to say, if that's your only perspective of the economy right now, there's absolutely nothing wrong. But yet, here again, we're seeing the PMI reports come out and say, hey, there's a slowdown here. We're seeing more and more big company announcements. It just hasn't impacted those weekly claims report, but it's suggesting that, yes, there is an underlying problem here with the economy that's not just about monetary policy. It's about demand destruction.
One of the things that you brought up, I think last week or the week before, when we talked about the state of consumers, was insurance costs, which seemed to go up a lot. I mean, and insurance showed up in the first quarter GDP. What a lot of people are saying is that first quarter GDP represents stagflation. This isn't a boom. This isn't a soft landing. This is stagflation. We've got too much inflation, especially in services prices. At the same time, economic growth suffers, which to me, that's not inflation. That's not stagflation. That's what we've been talking about all this time. But one of the numbers that really stood out, because you had mentioned this previously, and I think several times before, was the biggest increase in services costs came from financial services and insurance. And it was a really big jump, which is not inflationary, nor is it because of inflation. It's because insurance companies are saying, I got to jack up my rates for different reasons. But essentially, that what that means is that consumers and businesses now have an increased cost that they have to pay, because your only other option is to cancel your insurance, which most people are not going to do. So you're going to pay the increased insurance premium, which leaves you like higher gasoline costs with less spending for the rest of the economy. So it's not inflationary. It's not stagflationary. It leads to further demand problems down the rest of the world. So again, down the rest of the road. So it looks like, first quarter GDP is not stagflationary. It starts again looking like what we've been talking about all along, that these things, we can't afford these costs, but yet these costs keep hitting us.
It's interesting, Jeff, that you mentioned the term stagflationary here, because you look ahead of every recession and you see this trend, and what do you notice? Inflation tends to be rising and growth tends to be slowing, which is effectively exactly what we're seeing right now, except maybe inflation isn't really rising as much as it's just relatively elevated compared to kind of the last 20 years. But there's another factor that you throw in this extra variable, and you see decelerating, what I call total compensation, which is average hourly earnings multiplied by average weekly hours. But you could look at either one of them and say, okay, hours are going down, total compensation or hourly earnings are slowing. But what does that mean? Consumers can't absorb anything. So all of a sudden, as you mentioned, insurance costs go up and consumers have only one avenue to go. cut spending somewhere. Oh, energy prices went up too. I'll have to cut some more spending. And that's exactly what's getting reflected in the GDP, which is interesting because that's exactly how you started the show, is saying, is the GDP essentially starting to reflect what we've been seeing in all these surveys and other data? And it's really starting to look like that. Now, if we project forward a little bit, the surveys are saying it's going to get worse, which is not really what, of course, the Fed wants right now.
Well, another thing that was interesting too, while services prices were largely the reason for the stagflation or the big consumer price number that came out of the first quarter, goods prices actually declined for the second straight quarter, which, I mean, that tells me that demand for goods, if you're paying a lot more for insurance and you have less left over for goods, then probably goods prices are going to have to come down a little bit to adjust for weaker demand. So there is a consistent picture here. We also see that in inventories. You mentioned inventories. That's something that I've been talking about, specifically GDP inventories versus, say, the Census Bureau inventories. The Census Bureau's view of inventories is not at all as robust as GDP, because what we need is another data series that diverge from each other, right? We got enough of those. Let's have another one. So GDP says inventories were rising, even though the rate of increase has slowed down. While census says, especially the recent data just came out this week, says that inventories in nominal terms have been flat to slightly higher, not a lot, just a little bit. And then when you price adjust those, inventories are still shrinking at a pretty substantial rate. But what was interesting about the March statistics and inventories was that wholesale and retail inventories, when you exclude automobiles, those actually declined in March in nominal terms after somewhat of a rise in, say, January and February, which brings us back to the same question about oil prices and the economy rolling over from another potential oil shock. Do we see that in inventories now, where companies were somewhat optimistic at the end of last year are now rethinking and thinking, maybe I need to hold less inventory again?
Well, yeah, Jeff, we saw that in the PMIs. We saw the term destocking show up, that, there's like, why are new orders going down? Well, the reason is our customers are destocking. And what does that simply mean is they're not selling it through the way they want to. They've got too much of it because they were planning on this big second half boom that never showed up, or at least is not seeing the early signs of it showing up. So they're cutting their new orders to destock their inventory. Of course, when you cut new orders, as you know, Jeff, and you have a lack of backlog of orders, next thing you know, manufacturers are seeing a bunch of people stand around twiddling their thumbs and says, you know what, we can afford to get rid of a couple of you. And then, of course, you start to begin this slow spiral down where more people go on unemployment, their wages drop because they're on unemployment, their spending goes down. That leads to more destocking, more cuts in new orders, and more people losing their jobs.
It was interesting too. The services side of the economy, that was the one that S&P Global, I think, really for the data really stood out, was that it was employment. I mean, we talked about backlogs, we talked about new orders, and the rolling over employment, which suggested that there was something changed recently. Something got triggered. And what we've seen over the last, how long? I mean, however many months, because this has been a prolonged cycle, but over time, the data migrates. Most of it's over here. Everything looks great. Everything looks inflationary and hot and everything else. And then you see some of these other alternative statistics move into the opposite side of the ledger, and then a few more, and then a few more. And over time, if you pay attention, you see the macro accounts and the data migrate from economy's doing well, economy's doing inflationary, to economy's not doing well, economy's not inflation. So the data moves from the economy's doing hot, the economy's inflationary, to not. And I'm wondering now if, S&P Global is now moving in that direction. Although the PMIs overall have been lower last year, parts of the PMIs are moving in that direction as well, including employment. And so that brings up the question, GDP might be doing the same thing. And what does that leave us on the red hot booming inflationary economy, but maybe payrolls and not even the unemployment rate moving higher? So the point is, I think we keep seeing this very slow but persistent migration, even in macroeconomic accounts, from one side to the other. And it may be the GDP is finally decided to throw its hat in that side too.
Jeff, that's interesting because one of the shocking things about the services PMIs was the employment part. It wasn't the rest of it, because what do we continue to hear? The services sector is going to lead the manufacturing sector. Well, since never, but it's okay. Maybe this time it does. And then all of a sudden, and kind of going into summer, which to me is even more interesting because a lot of places hire up and then they'll trim a little bit later if demand isn't there. But here we see trimming in the services side. We're not, again, not seeing it in the weekly unemployment claims, not really seeing it in continued claims. Probably next Friday, we'll not see it in the non-farm payroll report. I'll just go on a limb on that one. Of course, we'll talk about that then. But it certainly looks like, as you said, the GDP data is catching up to what we're seeing in all of these reports, is that the U.S. economy is slowing down. Now, the question comes, does it stop? That's the big one. Everyone's hoping that this has got to be the bottom, and that's why we see equity prices rallying, as everyone's hoping the worst is now behind us. The question will be, do you think it is?
Well, there are so many factors to add up here, which is always why this is so complicated and makes it a little bit difficult. But among those is, we talked about insurance costs. That's a big one. That's something you got to pay. You've got gasoline prices that are going up. These are new things, new trends that have happened just recently, although we've seen this repeatedly through the last couple of years. We keep getting weaker and weaker every time we get another oil shock or another insurance price shock or another inflationary increase, whatever the case may be. So as we get weaker and weaker and weaker, we keep getting hit with higher and higher costs. And there's another factor that I've talked about recently that we haven't talked about specifically, and that's government transfers. Government has been supporting the economy to huge, just mind-boggling amounts for several years now. And recent data suggests that those transfers are starting to wind down too. So you add that up with savings, oil prices, insurance. Are we getting closer to the end of the rope? The economy finally getting to the point where it has one too many of these support legs knocked off of the stool?
Yeah, Jeff, it certainly looks that way. When you look at the savings rate declining down, then obviously we know that tends to put some pressure on inflation. It suggests that, consumers have been drawing down their savings as their total compensation growth continues to decelerate. Of course, we know there is a point where consumers will look at their savings account and say, well, that enough is enough. And then they're going to cut their spending even more. That just could be what tips us over the edge.
Yeah, we'll see. That would be an interesting next quarter, not just for the statistics. You're right. Payroll reports coming up. That's going to be what payroll reports are always going to be. It's the other statistics and how many of them actually move from one side to the other. It'll be interesting this quarter. Not inflation. I was going to sneeze. Shit. Now I don't have to. Okay.
I was like, oh crap, he's going to try to transition, but this isn't going to work.
No, I just think I almost sneezed.
No, I know. I thought you're literally trying to just throw the ball to me real quick, but it was just not quick enough. I wasn't ready.